Imagine standing in the middle of southern Africa, somewhere in what is now Zimbabwe, in the year 1871. The dry season has bleached the savanna gold. Acacia trees cast thin shadows across cracked earth. Your guide, a local man who knows this land the way you know the streets of your own city, gestures ahead and says nothing. He doesn't need to. Because there, rising out of the bush like something from another world entirely, are walls. Massive, curving, perfectly fitted walls of granite, stretching higher than a two-story building, running for hundreds of meters in every direction. No mortar, no cement, just stone placed on stone with a precision that makes your chest tighten. And at the center of it all, a tower, solid, conical, reaching toward the sky, that serves no obvious military or practical purpose, yet radiates a kind of authority that you can feel even now, 1,000 years after the hands that built it went still. The German explorer Karl Mauch stood in almost exactly this spot in 1871. He was not the first European to hear rumors of these ruins, but he was among the first to document them in detail for a Western audience. And what he wrote afterward tells you almost everything you need to know about what was about to go wrong. Mauch concluded that the ruins could not possibly have been built by Africans. He decided, based on almost nothing except his own assumptions, that the timber he found at the site smelled like cedar, and therefore must have come from Lebanon, and therefore the site must have been connected to the ancient Phoenicians, or perhaps to King Solomon himself, and the legendary land of Ophir described in the Bible. He wrote this down. People believed him. And for the next several decades, that belief, that comfortable, convenient, deeply wrong belief, would shape everything that happened to Great Zimbabwe. This is the story of a civilization that built one of the most remarkable architectural achievements in the medieval world. It is also the story of what happens when the people who find that achievement cannot bring themselves to accept who made it. And it is, ultimately, the story of how the truth survived anyway. To understand Great Zimbabwe, you have to go back much further than 1871. You have to go back to around the 4th century of the Common Era, when the ancestors of the Shona people began settling the high plateau between the Zambezi River to the north and the Limpopo River to the south. This is a region of extraordinary natural wealth. The plateau sits at an elevation that moderates the climate, making it cooler and wetter than the surrounding lowlands. The soil is fertile. The granite outcrops that define the landscape are not just scenery, they are a building material waiting to be used. And beneath the ground there is gold. Not in the quantities that would later fuel European fantasies, but real gold, accessible gold, gold that could be panned from rivers and traded across the Indian Ocean network that was by the first millennium of the Common Era one of the most sophisticated commercial systems in the world. Arab merchants had been sailing down the East African coast for centuries, trading cloth, glass beads, and porcelain for ivory, iron, and gold. The Swahili coast, places like Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, served as the gateway, and the plateau peoples controlled the supply. Great Zimbabwe itself began to take shape around the 11th century. The name, in the Shona language, means something like Great Stone Houses or Venerated Houses of Stone, Zimbabwe deriving from the words Zimbabwe, which translates roughly as Houses of Stone. The location was not chosen randomly. It sits near the confluence of trade routes, close to reliable water, on ground that offered natural defensive advantages. The granite outcrops surrounding the site provided building material, essentially on-site. Whoever chose this location understood both geography and power. And the power that grew here was real. By the 13th century, Great Zimbabwe had become the capital of a state that archaeologists and historians today call the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, though it is also sometimes referred to as the Rosvi state or the Karanga state in older literature. At its height, between roughly 1250 and 1450, this was the dominant political and economic force on the southern African plateau. Estimates of the population at the capital itself range from 10,000 to 18,000 people, a significant urban center by any standard of the medieval world. Here is the first thing that should stop you in your tracks. Great Zimbabwe was not a small settlement with some impressive walls. It was a city, a functioning, complex, hierarchically organized city with a ruling elite, specialist craftspeople, a trading economy integrated into global networks, and a built environment that expressed all of this in stone. The architecture is divided into 3 main areas. The hill complex sits on a granite outcrop overlooking the valley below. This is the oldest part of the site, and it was almost certainly associated with religious or ritual functions, possibly connected to the Shona spiritual tradition of the Mwari cult, a form of ancestor veneration and communication with a high deity. The valley ruins spread across the lower ground and represent the residential areas where the majority of the population lived. And then there is the Great Enclosure. The Great Enclosure is the structure that stopped Karl Mauch cold. It is the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Its outer wall is 250 meters in circumference. At its highest point, it reaches 11 meters, roughly the height of a 3-story building. The wall is 5 meters thick at the base. It contains an estimated 1 million blocks of granite, each one cut and shaped without metal tools, fitted together without mortar, and placed with a precision that has allowed the structure to stand for 7 centuries. Let that number settle for a moment. 1 million blocks of granite, shaped by hand, fitted without adhesive, standing for 7 centuries. The builders understood something about dry stone construction that modern engineers still find impressive. By slightly inclining the wall inward as it rises, they created a structure that is self-stabilizing. The weight of the upper courses actually helps lock the lower courses in place. This is not accidental. This is not lucky. This is the application of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations of builders who understood the physics of stone even if they would not have described it in those terms. Inside the Great Enclosure, the conical tower rises to a height of about 9 meters. It is solid. There is no interior chamber, no doorway, no hidden room. Its function remains a subject of scholarly discussion. Some researchers have suggested it represented a grain bin, a symbol of the ruler's ability to feed his people and therefore his legitimacy. Others have connected it to phallic symbolism and fertility cults. What is clear is that it was not defensive and not storage. It was symbolic. It was a statement, and statements like that are made by people who are confident in their power and their identity. The artifacts found at Great Zimbabwe confirm what the architecture implies. Excavations have uncovered Chinese porcelain from the Song and Ming dynasties, Persian faience, glass beads from the Indian Ocean Trade Network, Arab coins, and, critically, the famous soapstone bird sculptures, 8 of them discovered at the site, carved from a single piece of soapstone each, depicting a bird that may represent the bateleur eagle or a similar species associated with Shona spiritual belief. These birds were perched on monoliths inside the hill complex, and they are now the national symbol of Zimbabwe. They appear on the flag, the currency, the coat of arms. They are, in a very real sense, the signature of the civilization that built this place. The trade goods tell a story of extraordinary reach. Gold from the plateau was being exported to the Swahili coast, from there to Arabia, India, and China. In return, luxury goods flowed back. The elite at Great Zimbabwe were not isolated chiefs presiding over a simple agricultural society. They were participants in one of the most dynamic commercial networks of the medieval world, and they were wealthy enough and powerful enough to demand the finest goods that network could offer. Now here is where the story takes its darker turn. When European explorers and colonizers began arriving in southern Africa in the 19th century, they encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in a state of partial abandonment. The kingdom had declined by the mid-15th century, for reasons we will come to, and the site had not been a functioning capital for 400 years by the time Mauch arrived. The Shona people still lived in the surrounding region. They knew the site. They had oral traditions about it. They called it by its name. But to the Europeans arriving with their own assumptions, their own frameworks, their own needs, the ruins presented a problem. The problem was simple and devastating. The ruins were too impressive. They were too large, too sophisticated, too clearly the product of an advanced civilization. And in the mental world of 19th century European colonialism, an advanced civilization in sub-Saharan Africa did not fit the story that was being told to justify what was happening there. The story being told in newspapers, in government reports, in the popular imagination, was that Africa south of the Sahara was a land without history, without cities, without complex states, a land that needed to be brought civilization from outside. Great Zimbabwe was a direct physical contradiction of that story, and so the story had to be changed. Karl Mauch's Phoenician theory was just the beginning. Over the following decades, a remarkable parade of alternative explanations was offered for the ruins. They were built by ancient Arabs. They were built by Phoenician traders. They were the palace of the Queen of Sheba. They were the biblical Ophir, the source of King Solomon's gold. They were built by a lost white civilization. Each theory shared one essential feature. The builders were not African. The colonial administration of Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, who played a direct role in the story of Great Zimbabwe, actively promoted these theories. Rhodes himself visited the site in 1891, the year after his British South Africa Company had effectively seized control of the region. He was fascinated by the ruins and, like Mauch before him, found it impossible to accept that they had been built by the ancestors of the people his company was now subjugating and dispossessing. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary and troubling episodes in the history of archaeology. A journalist named Richard Nicklin Hall was appointed curator of the site in 1902. Hall was not an archaeologist. He was a true believer in the foreign origin theories. And over the next several years, he systematically destroyed the archaeological record of the site in his efforts to find evidence of the civilization he believed had built it. He excavated, if that word can even be used, by having workers remove layers of soil and debris without recording stratigraphy, without documenting artifact positions, without maintaining any of the basic standards that allow archaeologists to reconstruct the past. He was looking for Phoenician artifacts and Arab inscriptions. He found neither, but in his search, he destroyed evidence that could never be recovered. Hall published his findings in a book in 1905, arguing confidently for a non-African origin of the ruins. The book was well received in Rhodesia and in certain circles in Britain. It told people what they wanted to hear, but science does not ultimately bend to what people want to hear, and the scientific response was already building. As early as 1905, a professional archaeologist named David Randall Masiva visited the site and conducted a proper excavation. His conclusion was unambiguous. The ruins were medieval in date, and they were African in origin. The pottery, the artifacts, the construction techniques, everything pointed to the ancestors of the Shona people. He published his findings. He was largely ignored or dismissed or attacked. In 1929, the British Association for the Advancement of Science sent another archaeologist to settle the question definitively. Her name was Gertrude Catton Thompson. She was one of the most rigorous field archaeologists of her generation, and she was not going to be intimidated by political pressure or colonial sentiment. She excavated carefully, documented everything, and reached the same conclusion as Randall Masiva stated even more forcefully. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. It was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. It dated to the medieval period. There was no evidence, none, zero, not a fragment, of Phoenician, Arab, or any other external origin. Catton Thompson presented her findings at a major scientific conference and was met with hostility. She was accused of being politically motivated, of having an agenda, of getting it wrong. The attacks were not primarily scientific. They were political. Because the stakes were not really about archaeology. The stakes were about the legitimacy of colonial rule. If the ancestors of the people being dispossessed had built one of the great architectural achievements of the medieval world, then the entire justification for dispossessing them became harder to maintain. The colonial government of Rhodesia responded by making it effectively illegal to claim that Great Zimbabwe had been built by Africans. This is not a metaphor. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the white minority government of Rhodesia became increasingly isolated internationally and increasingly desperate to maintain its narrative, guides at the site were reportedly instructed not to attribute the ruins to the local African population. A museum curator who published a guide suggesting African origins was fired. The government controlled the story because the story was power. But stories have a way of escaping their cages. The liberation movements that fought against white minority rule in Rhodesia adopted Great Zimbabwe as a central symbol of their cause. The ruins were not just an archaeological site, they were proof. Proof that the people of this land had a history, a civilization, an achievement that predated European arrival by centuries. When the country achieved independence in 1980, the new nation named itself Zimbabwe. The soapstone birds that had been removed from the site, some of them taken to South Africa, were repatriated. The bird image became the national symbol. But let us return to the civilization itself, because the political story of the ruins should not overshadow the historical story of the people who built them. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe reached its peak between roughly 1290 and 1420. During this period, it controlled a trading network that stretched from the interior plateau to the Swahili coast, and through that coast to the wider Indian Ocean world. The ruler, known by a title that meant something like great ruler or lord, controlled access to gold, and through that control, access to the luxury goods that flowed back in return. This was the classic structure of a tribute-based trading state. The center extracted resources from the periphery and redistributed prestige goods downward to maintain loyalty. The elite at Great Zimbabwe expressed their status through architecture, through the possession of imported goods, and through control of cattle, which in Shona society, as in many African societies, was the primary measure of wealth and social standing. The cattle enclosures at the site are significant not just economically, but symbolically. Control of cattle meant control of the marriage economy, which meant control of social reproduction, which meant political power in a very direct and personal sense. The soapstone birds deserve a moment of attention, because they are among the most haunting objects to survive from this civilization. Each one is carved from a single piece of soapstone, standing on a monolith, and depicts a bird with human features, specifically human lips rather than a beak. The combination of bird and human is significant in Shona spiritual tradition. Birds, and the battler eagle in particular, are associated with the spirit world, with the ancestors, with communication between the living and the dead. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe may have claimed a special relationship with these spiritual forces, using the birds as markers of their divine or semi-divine authority. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the debate about who built the ruins. The people who built them had a rich spiritual and intellectual life. They were not simply building walls and trading gold. They were constructing a cosmology, a way of understanding their place in the universe, and they were expressing that cosmology in stone and sculpture and ritual. The ruins are not just impressive engineering. They are the physical expression of a worldview. The decline of Great Zimbabwe, when it came, was not sudden. By the mid-15th century, the political center of gravity on the plateau had shifted. The reasons are still debated among historians and archaeologists, but several factors seem to have played a role. The gold trade routes may have shifted, reducing the economic advantage of the Zimbabwe site. Environmental pressure, overgrazing, deforestation, soil exhaustion, may have made the area around the capital less able to support its large population. Political fragmentation, with regional chiefs asserting independence, may have weakened central authority. What is clear is that by around 1450, Great Zimbabwe had ceased to function as a major political capital. The population dispersed. Successor states emerged, most notably the Mutapa state to the north, which would later become the center of Portuguese attention and interference, and the Tawa state to the southwest, which continued the tradition of stone enclosure building at sites like Kami. The civilization did not simply vanish, it transformed, fragmented, and continued in different forms. This is another detail that tends to get lost. Great Zimbabwe was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a broader tradition of stone enclosure building on the southern African plateau, a tradition that spanned several centuries and produced hundreds of sites. The Zimbabwe plateau contains more than 200 stone enclosures, ranging from small homesteads to significant complexes. Great Zimbabwe is the largest and most sophisticated, but it is not unique in kind. It is the apex of a tradition, the way that a great cathedral is the apex of a tradition of stone church building. Understanding this context matters because it further dismantles the colonial narrative. The foreign origin theorists needed Great Zimbabwe to be an anomaly, a mysterious, isolated achievement that could only be explained by external intervention. But Great Zimbabwe is not an anomaly. It is the most impressive expression of a local tradition with deep roots and wide distribution. The knowledge that built it was not imported. It was developed, refined, and transmitted across generations of builders who lived on this plateau and knew its stone. The scientific consensus today is clear, and has been clear for a long time. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, beginning around the 11th century and reaching its architectural peak between the 13th and 15th centuries. The construction techniques are African. The artifacts are consistent with the Indian Ocean trade network as accessed through Swahili coast intermediaries. The spiritual symbolism is consistent with Shona religious tradition. There is no credible archaeological evidence for any external origin. The foreign origin theories were not scientific hypotheses that were disproven. They were political fictions that were never supported by evidence in the first place. What makes this story so important is not just the ruins themselves, though the ruins are extraordinary. What makes it important is what the ruins reveal about the relationship between knowledge and power. For nearly a century, A scientific truth that Africans built Great Zimbabwe was suppressed, distorted, and denied not because the evidence was ambiguous, but because the truth was politically inconvenient. The people with the power to control the narrative used that power to maintain a fiction, and the fiction caused real harm. It was used to justify dispossession, to deny the historical claims of a people to their own land, to construct a worldview in which African civilization was impossible. The archaeologists who got it right, Randall Masiva, Caton Thompson, were not heroes in the popular sense. They did not change the world with their findings in the short term. They were ignored, attacked, and dismissed, but they maintained the record. They kept the truth alive in the scientific literature until the political conditions changed enough for the truth to be heard. And the truth was also kept alive by the people it was about. The Shona did not need European archaeologists to tell them that their ancestors had built Great Zimbabwe. They knew. The oral traditions, the name itself, the continuity of spiritual practice, all of it maintained the connection between the living people and the stone city their ancestors had raised. When independence came, the nation that named itself after those ruins was not making an arbitrary choice. It was making a statement about memory, continuity, and the long arc of history. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Archaeologists continue to work there, using modern techniques, ground-penetrating radar, isotope analysis, detailed ceramic studies to fill in the picture that Hall's destructive excavations made so much harder to reconstruct. Each new study adds detail to what we know about the people who lived there. What they ate, how they organized their households, how they worshipped, how they traded, how they died. The picture that emerges is of a sophisticated, dynamic, cosmopolitan society that was fully integrated into the medieval world's most important commercial network, that developed a distinctive architectural tradition of extraordinary ambition and skill, and that expressed a rich spiritual and political culture in the buildings it left behind. A society that, for 2 centuries, was the dominant power on a vast and resource-rich plateau. A society whose achievements were denied for a century by people who could not imagine them, and whose name now graces an entire nation. Here is the final thought to carry with you. The walls of Great Zimbabwe are still standing. The conical tower is still standing. 7 centuries of sun, rain, and time have not brought them down. The people who tried to deny what those walls represented, to erase the civilization that built them from history, are themselves largely forgotten. The walls outlasted the denial. There is something in that worth sitting with. The most durable thing about Great Zimbabwe is not the stone, though the stone is remarkable. The most durable thing is the fact of it. It happened. It was built. It stood. And no amount of political pressure, no number of convenient theories, no curator with a shovel and an agenda could change that fundamental reality. The truth, like the walls, was always there. It just needed people willing to look at it honestly. If this story made you think differently about what civilization looks like, where it appears, and who gets to define it, that is exactly the conversation this channel exists to have. There are dozens of stories like this one, from every corner of the world, where the historical record is more complex, more impressive, and more human than the simplified versions we often inherit. Drop a comment below telling me which part of this story surprised you most. I read every one. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a good moment, because the next video goes somewhere you might not expect, and you do not want to miss the beginning. The story is just getting started.